I thought I was losing my mind, until a rock the size of a football smashed into the dirt right beside me. It hit so hard the red clay spit up into my face. I flinched, rolled behind a stump, and waited for the follow-up. Burst fire, grenades, anything. But the jungle didn't answer with gunshots. It answered with silence. The kind that swallows your breathing and makes your helmet feel too tight. I pressed my cheek to the stock of my M16 and scanned between trunks. Nothing but the green-black wall, 1,000 shadow fingers pointing at me. Night in the Central Highlands had a way of turning into a single, unbroken shape. You learn to read it by sound. The click of beetles, the soar rasp of frogs, the steady hiss of leaves rubbing in the wet wind. That night, all of it was gone, like someone had sucked the jungle empty and left us in a shell. "Contact," Smitty whispered from my left. He was close enough that I felt the tremor in his voice more than I heard words. "Rock," I said. "Thrown." Even saying it sounded stupid. People didn't throw rocks in a war thick with bullets and mines. Smitty's hand bumped my boot twice. Our quiet way of saying, "I heard you." A few feet behind, I could just make out Doc's silhouette, still as a tombstone. Farther back, Torres kept low over the PRC, 25, his headset tilted off one ear. He was waiting for me to call it in. I didn't. Not yet. You don't wake the whole world for a rock. Our point man, Lobo, real name Mitchell, but he'd earned the nickname for how he moved, was crouched 10 yards ahead. He raised a closed fist. "Freeze." I tasted copper, like I was chewing batteries. My finger found that spot on the trigger where pressure becomes decision. Another rock thumped into the earth to my right. Closer. Heavy, wet thunk like a sack of meat. This one rolled, bumping roots, and came to rest against my boot tip. I stared at it. Smooth. River-worn. Out here, miles from any clean water. That was wrong. I had the thought that it was warm, but that might have been my own heat talking. Smitty mouthed, "VC." I shook my head. If they had us, they'd be spraying, or closing, or mocking us with those whistles they use sometimes just to screw with our heads. Whoever, or whatever, was out there didn't feel like the calm. It felt like the jungle had grown a brain and decided we were an infection. A smell moved through the air then, under the damp and the rot. Musky, like wet dog and sour fruit mashed together. It crawled into my mouth and coated my tongue. Doc smelled it too. I saw him turn his head, nostrils flaring. Lobo shifted. His hand opened, 2 fingers forward, eyes up ahead. He'd seen something. I did that stupid thing you do when you don't want to blink, opening your eyes wider like you could drink more light. The tree lean moved. Not wind. Wait. I thought about the warning the Montagnard scout had given us a week earlier, back at the village. "Ngo I are you ing," he'd said, tapping his chest with 2 fingers, then pointing into the trees. "Forest people." He made a throwing motion afterward and laughed, like we were children who didn't understand where they were playing. We'd laugh back because sometimes that was the only way to keep your nerves from fraying apart. Torres scratched at the radio. "You gonna call?" He breathed. "Negative," I said, and hated how the word quivered. Something clicked in the dark. Not metal. Stone against bark. The hair on my neck lifted like it did when a claymore wire snagged your ankle in a bad dream. I swept my sightline low, then high. The canopy was a ceiling of black glass. "Listen," Doc whispered. We listened. Far off. A single bird chirped once. Then something answered it. Only it wasn't a bird. It was deeper, a round, chestia that vibrated through the ground and up my knees. It wasn't a tiger. It wasn't any sound I'd heard from an animal or a man. It was a statement. I am here. The next rock didn't thump. It cracked, hard, against the trunk 2 inches from Lobo's head and exploded into chips. He didn't flinch. Didn't even blink. He just put his palm down, slow, and we all melted to our bellies like we'd practiced it 1,000 times. I felt every grain of dirt through my sleeves. My heart got loud enough that I worried it would give me away. I counted 3 beats, slow as I could make them, then slid forward on elbows, inching toward Lobo. The smell got stronger, like something that had slept in its own sweat and fruit rinds for a week had woken up right next to us. The jungle did a trick of light then. I didn't see shape. I saw absence. A hunched patch where even the darkness had to bend around it. It moved, quietly, impossibly. I couldn't hear footsteps. I couldn't hear breath. I could only hear a pressed down rustle, like a hand smoothing tall grass. It stopped behind a clump of bamboo, 20 yards out. Smitty tapped my calf once, question mark. I answered with 2 taps, there. He aimed his barrel where my chin pointed. I didn't give a fire command. This wasn't like any break contact drill. This felt like a dare. Shoot, and you might just wake the part of the jungle that's asleep on purpose. Who's there? I heard myself whisper. Stupid, like I was on guard duty back home, checking a noise outside the wire. What answered wasn't words. It was a low chuckle that wasn't laughter at all, just breath rolling over something big, like air through a drum. Then a second shape stood up where I swear there had been only a tree stump. Taller, broad shoulders, arms hanging long. My throat went dry, so fast it burnt. I pulled the stock into my shoulder until the plastic creaked. That was when the first scream came. It didn't rip the air. It pressed it. A deep, layered sound that made the leaves vibrate and my teeth ache. It went on longer than a man could carry a note. When it stopped, the silence felt like a drop in pressure before a storm. Another rock flew, this one arcing high and slow enough that my brain had time to track it. I remember thinking, that's not possible. That weight doesn't travel like that. It smashed a branch and fell. Not near us, but close enough that I heard its roll. I saw something else then in the brief belt of sky. 2 red points like coals. Not glowing bright, just catching some scrap of moon and feeding it back wrong. On my mark, I whispered, but the mark never came. Because the shapes didn't charge. They didn't flank. They stayed just on the limit of what we could convince ourselves we saw. Watching. Doing the things smart enemies do. Control the time. Control the pace. Make you burn your nerves as a weapon. Torres exhaled. Sarge, he said, forgetting I wasn't one. We can pop a flare. One. We carry one. A flare would splash the jungle in hard white for a breath and draw every living thing with a rifle for miles. We weren't supposed to use one unless we were overrun. I thought about it anyway. The need to see was like thirst. Negative, I said. Trip flares. Back on the LZ, Smitty said. Useless weight on patrol. Useful only when you already knew where you were sleeping. Tonight we didn't. There was a soft thwack behind us where no one should have been. We spun together as if we were on strings. A stone had landed near the radio. Torres flattened over the set like he could shield it with his ribs. I swung back forward. The first patch of dark had moved closer by a yard, maybe less. I tried to measure it against the bamboo, to prove it to myself. A fly landed on my cheek, and I almost screamed from the simple, normal touch of it. I remembered then a story I'd brushed off in the hooch. An old Marine out by Key, since swearing a troop of rock apes had surrounded a hill and thrown until his men ran out of ammunition from shooting at shadows. We'd laughed, called them spooked. I didn't laugh now. I didn't do anything at all, because something stepped out from the bamboo and stood square to us. It wasn't a man. It wasn't a bear. God knew we didn't have bears out here. It wasn't a gibbon or macaque either. I'd seen those in daylight. Scrappy little thieves with wise eyes. This was taller than any man in our squad by a head, with a chest like a barrel and arms that hung past the waist. The hair wasn't long and shaggy like the cartoons. It was short, matted by rain, slick against thick muscle. The head sat low, no neck to speak of, and the face, Christ, the face was too much like ours in all the ways that mattered and none of the ways that would make it feel safe. It looked right at me, not through me, not past me, at me. I set my sights on center mass and kept my finger floating, trembling, not wanting to be the one who started the kind of fight that ends you. The thing bent, scooped a stone with a long-knuckled hand, weighed it like a pitcher feeling the seams, and tossed it underhand. It landed 5 feet in front of my muzzle, gentle, as if it were making a point about what it could do and wasn't doing. Then it tilted its head. I felt the weirdest sensation, like I was being measured and found small. Behind it, another shape shifted. Another pair of eyes caught a drip of moon. A third scream rose, not as long as the first, but closer, and this time there was an answer from farther off. 2 places at once, maybe 3. Back, I whispered, though there was nowhere to go but through them or deeper into the trees. Slow. We started to crawl, but the moment we moved, the one in front took a single step forward. No rush, just a reminder. I stopped. It stopped. The jungle breathed with us. I don't know how long that standoff lasted. Time bent around fear, got stretchy and useless. My elbows were mud-soaked, my cheek pressed into an ant trail I couldn't feel, my eyes burning for not blinking. The thing lifted its chin once, as if catching a scent on the wet air. Then it did something I didn't expect. It turned its head to the side and made a low, bubbling sound, almost a purr. The shapes behind it shifted, turned, and one by one melted back into the dark. The big one lingered. It looked at me one last time, opened its mouth just enough to show a flat, heavy set of teeth, and exhaled. The smell rolled over me. Wet hair, fermented fruit, old blood, and bandages. Then it was gone, like a piece of the jungle had decided to remember it was only trees. The sounds returned in ragged pieces. A frog, a drip, a cricket stuttering like a bad engine. We didn't move for a full minute after that. When we finally did, it was together, an inch at a time, until the green closed between us and the clearing where we'd nearly lived and died. Torres swallowed. What the hell was that? I wanted to say enemy because enemies you can map and brief and kill. I wanted to say nothing because nothing is safe and won't follow you into your sleep. What I said was the only thing that made sense in a place where sense had limits. I said, we just got warned. We didn't speak on the hike back. Even the radio stayed quiet. When we reached the LZ, the world felt smaller, like the jungle had been listening and now it knew our names. That night, on perimeter, the wind shifted and brought the smell again. Faint, but there. I kept my eyes on the tree lean until they burned and watered. And somewhere, not close but not far enough, something answered a bird with a sound that lived in my bones. I didn't sleep. Not because I couldn't. Because I didn't want to dream about the moment those eyes measured me and decided to let me go. I didn't sleep for 2 nights after that patrol. Every time I shut my eyes, I heard that scream again. Low at first, then rising until it felt like my chest would cave in. I'd jolt awake, sweat soaking my shirt, hand reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. In daylight, with the birds screaming and the heat pressing down like a fist, I almost convinced myself it hadn't happened. Almost. But the smell lingered in my nose, sour and heavy, and the memory of those eyes, red when they caught the moonlight, wouldn't fade. Worse than the sight itself was the way it looked at me. Not like prey, not like an enemy, like something weighing me on a scale I couldn't read. Smitty broke the silence first, 2 mornings later, while we choked down powdered eggs and canned peaches. So we're gonna talk about it, he muttered, or keep acting like it was just a bad dream. Nobody answered. Torres stirred his coffee, so long the spoon clinked against the tin cup. Steady, nervous. Lobo spat into the dirt and went back to checking his rifle. Doc just stared at his bandages like he could hide inside them. Finally, I said it. They weren't calm. Smitty let out a sharp laugh that had no humor in it. No shit. That song don't throw rocks the size of helmets and growl like gorillas. Torres glanced at me. You gonna tell command? I shook my head. And say what? That we saw what? Big apes. They'll write us up for jungle fever and pull us out. Hell, maybe that's not a bad idea. But they won't believe it. Maybe they don't need to believe it, Doc said, voice quiet. Maybe they just need to know there's something out there, so the next guys don't walk blind into it. That made us all pause, because the truth was, the jungle was big enough to hide an army, or something worse. That night, back on perimeter duty, I kept my ears straining. The cicadas shrieked, the frogs croaked, but every so often the noise dipped, like the whole forest held its breath. Each time, I gripped my rifle tighter. Nothing came, but the waiting was its own kind of torture. On the 3rd night, just before dawn, Torres nudged me awake. His eyes were wide, finger pressed to his lips. Hear that? At first I thought it was the wind. Then I realized it was too heavy, too rhythmic. Branches cracking. Footsteps. Not one. More than one. We scrambled to the tree line, crouched low. The jungle was gray in the pre-dawn light, shadows bleeding into each other. The footsteps stopped. Then came the sound, a soft whump, like a stone hitting dirt. Another, and another. Smitty cursed under his breath. They're back. I motioned for silence. My mouth was dry. My heart was pounding against my ribs, so hard it felt like it would shake me apart. The rocks kept landing just outside the perimeter, deliberate, one after another, as if drawing a circle around us. Then came the smell, that same sickly sweet stench of sweat and rot. My stomach turned. "Show yourself," I shouted before I could stop myself. My voice cracked, rough from fear and sleeplessness. The jungle answered with a scream. This one closer, louder. The sound hit my chest like a blast wave, rattling my teeth. I dropped to one knee, rifle up, sight searching, and then I saw them. Figures, 4, maybe 5, standing just beyond the edge of light. Not charging, not hiding, just standing, their massive outlines barely visible, their eyes catching the faintest glow. Smitty whispered, "Jesus Christ." I squeezed the trigger halfway, breath locked in my chest. But they didn't move closer. They didn't throw. They just watched. For a long moment, it felt like the whole world was holding still, waiting for one side to make the first mistake. Finally, one of them lifted a long arm and slammed its fist against a tree. The crack echoed like a rifle shot. The others answered with a chorus of low grunts. Then, just as suddenly, they melted back into the trees, swallowed by the gray light of morning. Silence followed. Not the jungle silence we'd felt before. This was the silence of men who'd just seen something they couldn't explain. Doc swallowed hard. They weren't attacking. They were warning us. No one argued. But in my gut, I knew the truth. They hadn't come to warn us. They'd come to remind us they were still there. And next time, they might not stop at throwing rocks. The warning ended at dawn, but the dread didn't. We were pulled off perimeter rotation the next day, ordered to push deeper into the hills on a search and destroy sweep. Rumors of sewn caches, tunnels, ambush points. But none of us were thinking about the calm. Every footstep felt like we were walking into a trap, but not the kind command had warned us about. The jungle was heavier that day, if that makes sense. The air clung to my skin, wet and sticky, and every vine felt like it was reaching for me. By mid-afternoon, the birds were gone. I noticed first, then Smitty, then Torres. The silence fell in waves until even Lobo stopped dead, holding his fist up, eyes scanning the canopy. Then came the first rock. Not near us. At us. It exploded against a tree trunk, showering splinters over the squad. Instantly rifles came up, safeties clicked, fingers curled. Contact, Torres shouted. We opened fire on the tree lean in a roar of gunfire. M16s spat brass, the jungle tore open, and the smell of cordite drowned out the stink of rot for a moment. Then the screams came. Not human, not animal. A chorus, high and guttural, rolling over us from 3 directions. My stomach flipped as a massive shadow broke through the brush to our right. It charged on 2 legs, faster than a man, its arms swinging wide. Jesus Christ! Doc yelled. I fired 3-round bursts, watching the tracers stitch across its chest. It stumbled, roared, and hurled a boulder that tore a branch clean off above my head. The impact shook the ground. More shapes moved in. 6, 8, I couldn't count. They were huge, hairy, their eyes burning in the dim light. Some threw rocks, others tore saplings from the ground and swung them like clubs. Fall back, Lobo bellowed, but there was nowhere to go. The jungle had closed in behind us, shadows flanking us from both sides. One of them barreled straight through Smitty. It hit him with a shoulder, sent him spinning to the dirt. He screamed as it raised a branch overhead like a spear. I lunged, firing, yelling until my throat burned. The thing turned its head, and in that second Smitty rolled away, clutching his bleeding arm. Another rock smashed into Torres's radio pack, sparks spraying as the unit shattered. He went down screaming, clutching his back. The squad was falling apart. I don't remember deciding to do it, but I pulled the flare from my belt, snapped the cap, and fired. The jungle exploded into harsh white light. For a split second, I saw them all. Dozens. Not 4. Not 5. Dozens of massive, man-shaped beasts circling us in the trees. Hair plastered to their bodies with sweat, chests heaving, teeth bared. The light painted their eyes like glass marbles. And then the flare began to dim. They screamed again, the sound rolling into my bones. One charged me, arm raised, and I fired until the rifle clicked dry. The creature staggered, blood matting its fur, but it didn't fall. It howled in my face, hot breath slamming against me, and I thought that was it. That was the end. But Lobo lit the last claymore. He slammed the clacker, and the blast tore the jungle apart in fire and steel. The front line of shapes dropped in a spray of blood and smoke. The rest scattered, their screams fading as they melted back into the darkness. Silence again. But this time, it wasn't the jungle. It was us, stunned, ears ringing, chests heaving, staring at the shredded tree line where we'd barely survived. I looked down at my rifle, still smoking, hands trembling. We'd held them off, but I knew it in my bones. They weren't gone. They were regrouping. And next time, we wouldn't have claymores or flares to save us. We limped back to what was left of our clearing with a handful of hours to spare before dark. The claymore had saved us. Lobo's quick hands and the explosive had carved a smoking line through whatever led the charge. But that didn't make the night easier. If anything, it made the jungle angrier. I could feel it in the way the leaves hunched and in the way the air tasted metallic like a wound. We worked without speaking much. Torres and Doc patched the worst of the cuts while Smitty and I dug shallow foxholes and dragged whatever branches we could to make a deadfall barrier. We didn't have wire. We didn't have a perimeter of sandbags, just sweat, tin cans, and a pile of splintered trees. The flare had burned our last cheap piece of light. The radio was a chunk of plastic smoking in Torres' lap. Someone kept checking the horizon, as if a human enemy would obey the rules that saved them at dawn. Set the claymore facing east, Lobo said, voice flat. He had that look then. The soldier look, where everything else has gone soft and their face gets carved by the job. If they come from the lower brush, we want to bite out of their first wave. We strung tripwire using pieces of bootlace and a grenade pin for a makeshift rattle. It felt foolish and desperate and somehow exactly right. We salted the ground with spent casings, like offering to anything that counted counts. Night crawled in like wet wool. The jungle sounds changed as the light died, familiar noises sliding into new keys. Frogs that had sung all day fell quiet. Something out there cleared its throat, a long rolling sound that made my ribs ache. I checked my mags 3 times. I felt Smitty's eyes on me and gave him the tight nod we'd used when younger men made the wrong move on patrols. No jokes. Save breath. We ate cold rations that tasted like the inside of a boot and tried to laugh once, a short bark that didn't make it past the trees. Lobo took watch first, then me. I sat with the barrel across my knees, thinking about small things, the way sunlight caught on rifling, the smell of hot brass, Torres' quiet cursing over a broken radio. Because if I let my brain wander into the whole big thing, I could feel it fold me under like jungle vines. At about midnight, the warning came. It wasn't a single rock this time. It was a signal, 3 dull thumps in quick succession, like a knuckle tapping a hollow log. Then another, from the opposite side of the clearing. The sounds moved around us, methodical. This wasn't hunting. This was an announcement. Smitty hissed. They're circling. His voice was paper thin. Around us, men moved like shadows, weapons lifted, breaths held. A flare rose. Lobo fired it up like a preacher throwing a Bible on the fire. The light bloomed white and mean, the clearing a flat stage with us as terrified performers. For a second I saw the shapes. Dozens, maybe more, standing just beyond the light where the trees thickened, leaning, watching. In the flare's wash you could see the outline of their shoulders and the way their arms hung, long and patient. One of them stepped forward and banged a rock on an upright stump, the sound echoing. Then it yanked the stump free and hurled it. It landed 20 feet from Torres, scattering splinters and the little pile of rations we'd left by the radio. The animals, if they were that, knew where to aim. They threw for supplies, for heat, for anything that pointed to life. We opened up. Headlamps and muzzle flashes painted the trees in ragged stabs of white. The first wave that crossed into the rim of light met a wall of fire. Bodies, if you could call them that, weaved in arcs and slipped away, not retreating in panic, but pulling back like tide. They didn't flee as humans do. They collected themselves and flowed. Then the second phase started. They began to test our defenses. Not full-on charges, but probes. A figure would creep within distance, dip a hand to snatch a boot or a pack, feel for weight, then back off. One of them, smaller than the others, climbed a branch and sat there, watching us, legs curled, chin on knees like a kid on a stoop. It looked at me, unblinking, and I remember how small my hands looked on my rifle. Doc took a round in the shoulder during one of those probes. The bastard had come in low and fast, slamming a branch into the Doc's midsection. Doc screamed, real and human, and we answered in fire and cries. I felt something yank at the back of my pack. Smitty dove and landed on his belly, dragging a thick arm into his jaws. He rolled, elbowed, and a tree sapling cracked against the creature's side. The thing released him and vanished like it had never been there. We tried everything conventional. We fired tracer to mark the night, but the tracers made them glow, and sometimes the glow seemed to make them bolder, like stars told them where to aim. We shouted, banged pots, lit a second flare, even blasted the last of our smoke grenades. Nothing broke the pattern. At one point, Lobo stepped into the shallow light and called, "If you want us, you come through. We're not running." That made them laugh, a sound like 100 rocks rubbing together, and the response came not in attack, but in a slow, dreadful ritual. They began to pound stones on deadwood in time, a rolling cadence that made the earth feel like a drum. From deeper trees, answer a harsher, higher keening, and then, as if summoned, more shapes resolved out of the dark. Women? I couldn't tell. Small ones, large ones. They moved in ranks now, not chaotically but with dark order, and the smell came in waves so thick it clung to our faces. A sob caught in my throat as I watched one of them raise a hand, slow and deliberate, like an elder raising a palm to bless. The others dropped to a crouch. They weren't just surrounding us. They were performing something. A watch, a vigil, a sentence. Smitty swore and fired at the one that had been watching me from the branch. It didn't flinch. It blinked, and in the flare of light, its eyes were not red now, but an ugly, knowing yellow. It threw a rock. It didn't aim to kill. It aimed to scare. The rock arced and smashed into our mess kit, sending steam and tin clattering. The act was almost polite. It was a message. We can take what we want. Hours scraped by. The jungle kept its slow percussion, sometimes loud, sometimes only a whisper. At some point, exhausted fingers slipped and the flares burned to nothing. The night went black as spilled ink. In that black, I heard it, close, right behind me, a breath like a bellows. I turned, muzzle up, and saw the silhouette of the big one leaning close, not attacking, just exhaling hot, rank air over my head. Its face was inches away, and I could see the moon reflect off a wet, flat nose. For a second the world narrowed, until it was just its breath and my pulse. Then it leaned back and, with enormous, slow hands, set something on the ground in front of me. A helmet. Not taken. Placed. Upright. Filthy. Balanced as if on a pedestal. The creature touched it once, a single finger to the crown, then tapped the top of its own head in a motion I'll never forget. Something like respect, maybe a challenge. The tiny touch echoed like a final punctuation. Smitty cursed, a raw sound that tore out of him. Lobo barked an order I didn't understand until it happened. We didn't fire. We didn't move. We watched like children watching a ritual we'd been warned off. Then, one by one, they melted away, not running but dissolving into the dark like ink dropped into water. At first light, the clearing was littered with tracks, huge prints pressed into mud, smears where a body had dragged something heavy. The helmet I'd found in front of me was gone. In its place was a shallow scorched ring on the dirt, and a single dark hair stuck in the crust. We were alive. Not unmarked, not whole, but alive. And we had a new, terrible knowledge. They could be cruel without killing. They could take, leave riddles, mark us like trespassers on land that didn't answer to maps. We buried the dead as best we could, hastily, with rocks and prayer, and Vidalia's half-empty can of peaches, and tried to speak about the night in normal words. We failed. What we called it, rock apes, Bachatut, whatever the Muntnards whispered, felt suddenly like an insult, like calling a tiger a cat. That night the stars hid behind smoke. In my sleep, I dreamed of hands placing small offerings at the edge of the trees, of eyes watching from hollows. I woke because Smitty was sobbing, not from pain, but because something he couldn't name had touched him in a way that words couldn't heal. I thought we had survived the worst. I was wrong. We didn't walk out of that jungle. We bled out of it, piece by piece, men stripped from us until only shadows remained. The siege on the ridge was the breaking point. I still hear the sound of Doc's scream when they dragged him into the mist. Still hear the wet snap of Torres's rifle going silent mid-burst. Lobo, God, Lobo, he didn't run. He stood his ground and bought us seconds with a wall of fire, knowing damn well seconds was all he had to give. When the rocks came down on him, the sound was like thunder cracking against bone. Smitty and I ran. Don't ask me how far. The jungle swallowed time. Sometimes I thought the trees were chasing us, shifting closer with every blink. My lungs burned, legs turned to rubber, but I kept moving because stopping meant hands reaching out of the dark. We found a ravine before dawn, mud thick enough to hide in. We crawled into it like rats, shoulder to shoulder, rifles across our chests, waiting for the final blow. But it never came. Instead, they surrounded us. We couldn't see them, but we felt them. The stink rolled over the ridge, heavy and sour. Rocks clattered against the lip of the ravine, deliberate, teasing. Then came the rhythm, stones pounding on trunks, dozens of hands keeping time, a heartbeat bigger than ours. And then silence. The sun came up pale and gray, filtering through the mist. The valley looked empty, but we knew better. We crawled out slow, every step a dare. Smitty's arm was useless, blood-crusted black, his face hollow. Mine wasn't much better. We didn't talk. Words felt too small for what had happened. Hours later, we stumbled onto a patrol from another unit. Their lieutenant asked what the hell had chewed us up. We told him ambush, so anything but the truth. Because how do you explain the truth? That the jungle itself had risen up, wearing the shape of men and apes, and decided to remind us we were trespassers. Smitty made it back to base, but not for long. He drank hard, stopped sleeping, said he heard rocks tapping outside the wire at night. One morning they found him gone, rifle missing, boots gone, tracks leading into the treeline. No one ever saw him again. As for me, I got shipped home after a few more months. Stateside, the noise of traffic was louder than any firefight, but some nights it still goes silent, just like the jungle did, and I know they're near. In the dark, I swear I smell that stench. Wet hair, rot, and blood that isn't mine. People laugh when I tell them about the rock apes. They say it was the heat, the fear, the war twisting my head. Maybe they're right, but I'll tell you this. War shows you the worst of men. Vietnam showed me something worse than men. And sometimes, when the world goes quiet, I think about that ridge, about the helmet placed at my feet like an offering, and I realize they let me live. Not because I beat them, but because they wanted someone to remember.